Check. Okay. Not yet? There it is. Okay. Let me just begin with prayer. Father, as we look to this passage this morning, may you enter into our temple. May you do whatever needs to be done. Speak to us, Lord, in Jesus' name. Amen. So we continue with John, and we continue beginning with the prologue. Just to highlight very quickly the first 18 verses, we understand that the prologue is the key for us as readers to understand the whole of what's being written. We have this advantage that the people who actually were in the story of what we're reading about today didn't have. We have the advantage of the prologue to understand what's being said and how to kind of interpret that. And so we've been saying that the prologue focuses on this idea of God and the Word. The prologue focuses on this idea of God being the Word and the Word being with God. And it focuses on the idea of us having the ability to become children of God. So when we read something in the text, we need to understand these things, and we need to understand why John wrote the Gospel of John. Towards the end of the Gospel, he reveals that, and we look at that again. Jesus did many other miraculous signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. He mentions the word signs 17 different times. John, as we pointed out last week, doesn't call these events miracles. He calls them signs. And what I believe he's doing is he's not pointing to the event, he's pointing to the one who performed the event. So they're miracles, yes, but to John they're signs that point to Christ. It doesn't stop at the event itself. And then we read, but these things, the things that are written in this book, are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life to its fullest in his name. We talked that the prologue deals a lot with this term, logos. It's a Greek word that means word. And we see that in this prologue, these verses that are critical for us to just keep washing over. And I realize I'm doing this every week, but you please realize this is important for us to keep right in the front. These are the eyeglasses that we read the rest of this text. And so it tells us, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And later it tells us that this word, this logos, became flesh and lived for a while among us. We've seen his glory, the glory of the one and only who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. And that John will echo this all throughout the rest. And so today we find ourselves looking at this text, John chapter 2, verses 12 to 25. And we see interesting that it begins the Jewish Passover, and they went up to Jerusalem. And we see that at the end, we see that while they were in Jerusalem at the Passover, so these two bookends are kind of put there for us to see this segment that's in between. And so we're going to look at this text this morning. We're going to start by this part, and then we're going to move to that part. So this part here deals with Jesus walking into the temple, and we'll walk through all of that. And then this is their response to what happens in the temple. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. Sometimes things just go over our heads. Sometimes we just don't get it. There's actually, do you know that, there's actually on the internet starting to grow in popularity blonde guy jokes. So, yeah, and they'll probably move towards, dark-haired guy jokes and stuff too. So a blonde guy joke. Someone sends a text and says, "Hey, have you heard the one about the airplane?" Person says, "No, let's hear it." The person texts back and says, "Nah, never mind, it'll go over your head." The person sends back saying, no, I'm pretty smart, try me. Just like right over the head. When I was a kid, we had street lights. And we had to be home when the street lights came on. Do you remember that? And so there were street lights everywhere. And the street lights, I imagine, if we were to bring them back today, we would think that it's not really providing very much light at all. But there was a street light on the street down below where I lived. And it was even one of the older kinds of street lights. So here's what it looked like. It looked like a trash can lid with a light bulb in the middle. Does anybody remember street lights, looking like that? So it's like this big trash can lid and a bulb. And the trash can lid acted as a shield from the weather, and for some strange reason they thought it would reflect the light better. But I remember as a kid making snowballs and throwing them at the trash can lid. I was not throwing them at the bulb. I was throwing the snowballs at the trash can lid. I swear to right here, all right? I was not shooting a snowball at the light bulb. And the woman who lived in the house next to the street light was fiercely known. I'll leave it at that. So she opens the door, right? And she hollers out at me, I know what you're doing. You're gonna break that street light, and I'm gonna call and talk to your mother. She did that all the time. And I remember saying back to her with the greatest amount of confidence, I am not shooting a snowball at the bulb. And she replies back, don't get smart with me. And I reply back, what? I'm telling you the truth. I'm not shooting a snowball at the bulb. I'm shooting it at the thing around the bulb. She just didn't get it. Perhaps I just didn't get it. I remember dating a person before Annie who was going through a divorce at the time. She had moved back into the house with her mom, and we were together. We were driving in her car, and we were going back to her mother's house. And she said to me, I need to stop at the pharmacy to get my prescription. I said, okay. So we pull into the pharmacy, and she goes, okay, I'm going to go in and get my prescription. Do you want to come in with me? And I said, no, I'll just wait. No, you should come in with me. All right, so I go in, and I wait in line with her, and we're talking, and they give her her prescription. It's in this strange, like, clamshell plastic case. And she turns around, and she says, well, I've got my prescription. And I said, great. We're all set. Because I didn't know what that was. And for some of you, this might be going right over your head, and if it does, that's fine. So we get back to her house, and we're going in, and she goes, well, I don't want to forget my prescription. I said, okay. And then we go up to her room, and we're going to listen to some music, and I remember the Police album that was playing, Roxanne, and she gets up and she closes the door. And I got up and I opened the door. And she looked at me very strangely and said, well, what are you doing? And I said, well, my parents have always told me if I'm at a girl's house out of respect for her and her parents that I would never leave a door closed. And she broke up with me, like, days later. and then years later, I went, aha. there was something being said under the words that went right over my head. I remember when I was an engineer, really doing well, and I had my performance review. And my boss, he brings me in for my review, and it's an amazing review, of course, right? Everything about it is just super, just a great review. And then he closes the folder and he says, "Can I talk to you off the record?" I said, "Sure. What's going on?" He goes, "Well, it's about your hair." You see, at that time, I was the typical software engineer and had my hair in a ponytail. And he said, "It's about your hair. Don't you think it's getting a little bit too long?" I said, "Well, I am so glad you," because I was always good at coming back with something. I said, I am so glad you brought that up because I've been meaning to talk to you about something." And he said, "Oh, really? What's that?" And I goes, "You're bald." He said, "What?" I said, "You're bald. There's Hair Club for Men, there's Rogaine, there is all kinds of transplant things that you can do. There are remedies for that. And honestly, you should do something." And he's like, What does my hair got to do with it? That have to do with anything?" And I said, "Exactly." And he looked at me and he said, laughed, and he said, "Okay, understood." And I walked out of there just thinking, am I good? Never mentioned the hair again. But I did find out later that he was grooming me for another promotion, and that the vice president that I would be reporting to had a problem with my hair. And all he was trying to do was set me up, but it went right over my long hair. There are times when we, whether for good or for bad, just totally don't see it. We totally don't get it. That's what we're about to see happen in this story. And not only for the first time, but this is going to happen throughout John's gospel. Jesus is going to say things, and people are not going to get it. It's going to go right over their heads. So let's start with the beginning here. After this, he went down to Capernaum. Now, I'm likely to say Capernaum because I've always pronounced it that way. And when we were in Israel, we learned a different way to pronounce it. And so if I say it a different way, no one's really sure what is the correct pronunciation. Okay, so after this, they went down to Capernaum with his mother and brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there for a few days. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. So what we see here is a few days, and in the Greek text, it's really not saying a few days. It's really an undetermined number of days. Don't know whether it was a few days. We don't really know whether it was a longer period of time. But what we do know is that they go to Capernaum. They go to Capernaum for a length of time that leads up to this thing called the Passover. And at the Passover, people made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So after he turns the water into wine, as we looked at last week, the next thing that happens is they go to the shore of Galilee, to this town in Galilee, and they just wait it out. They're there. And Capernaum becomes Jesus' home base throughout most of his northern ministry in Galilee. And so a few days, we don't really know, but it's really just setting up for the almost time for the Jewish Passover. So here's where they are on a map, and they're in Capernaum, which is on the northwest side of the Sea of Galilee, and they're going to travel by foot down to Jerusalem for the Passover service, and it's a distance of about 85 miles that they'll be walking. So further than here to Boston. but doable. And so they, whatever number of days before the Passover that they needed, they would have been planning this particular walk. And I wonder if while they're there with Jesus' mother, with his brothers, as they're getting ready and preparing for the Passover feast, as they're thinking about all of this, I wonder if Mary shares with Jesus, probably again, a story of what took place in Jerusalem 30 years before. And here's what happened. There was a man, his name was Simeon. He was an older man, and he was always in the temple praying to God, praying and praying. And God had revealed to him that he would not die until he saw the Lord's Christ. And so after Jesus is born, and after the time of purification for his mother, they get to the place where they can travel, and the first thing that they do is they go to Jerusalem to present the child to the temple. And as they walk into the temple, this person, Simeon, who has been waiting and praying for them, he sees them in the midst of all of the people that were there. And he holds the baby in his arms, and he says this, "Sovereign Lord, as you have promised, you now dismiss your servant in peace. For my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared in the sight of all people, a light for revelation to the Gentiles and for glory to your people Israel." The child's father and mother marveled at what was said about him. So this is a huge event in Mary's life. This is kind of a redeeming thing, where there's questions about the birth and so forth, and they bring him in, and here is Simeon, and they're marveling at these things, and the next thing that Simeon says to Mary, and he says to her, "And a sword will pierce your side as well," and predicts the death of Christ. And while they're still there, another woman who had been praying for 84 years, she had been praying for the ability to see the sight of the Christ, and she comes and meets them, and she sees them and talks to them and prays with them. And so at Jesus' birth, there's this temple experience, and we don't know a lot about Jesus' childhood, but Luke also tells us that at the age of 12, that Jesus is left behind as they're heading back home after a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And they come back and they search for him frantically. They've lost God's son. They know this is a big thing. You don't lose this. And so they come back and they're searching for him frantically, and they find him in the temple after 3 days. After 3 days, they found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. Everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. And so at an age of 12, the age before becoming a man, Jesus is confounding the religious leaders of the day, and he's doing it in Jerusalem. And so these are things that are happening in Jerusalem. And so again, we have this picture of this Jesus and his disciples in Galilee. And when you look at the map, you think that they're going down to Jerusalem. But as we learned on our trip to Israel, you never say down to Jerusalem. From wherever direction you go, you are going up to Jerusalem. And so Jesus and his disciples are going up to Jerusalem. And I just want to point this out to you as well, because this is all background information that's really needed. Psalm 120 to 134 are called the Psalms of Ascent. Well, what does that mean? I remember reading Psalms for many times, and I saw it begin by saying the Psalm of Ascent. And you know what? It just went like, because I didn't know what that meant. But the Psalms of Ascent, this packet of Psalms, were memorized and sung as people were walking up to Jerusalem. And it's a big deal. When we went to Israel on our trip, we took the bus ride. We didn't take the long route. We took the bus ride from the Sea of Galilee to Jerusalem, and our tour guide was Jewish. And he made this huge event because it was, to him, we get to this place and the bus stops and he says on the microphone, he tells us, "You are about to see Jerusalem." And they played a song about, Jerusalem over the sound system on the bus. And he tells us about Jerusalem. And then the bus moves forward and we see from the distance the city of Jerusalem. And we're all just staring at this. And our guide is crying because it is such a monumentous event for your eyes to behold Jerusalem. And so that's where we are. We have these Psalms of Ascent. And so one of those, Psalm 121, I just I know it, but just in case. Imagine you're with Jesus and you're walking to Jerusalem. You might be laughing, you might be talking about all kinds of things. You might be telling the story of the clamshell. You might be talking about all kinds of different things. But when you approached to start to see Jerusalem, everything would grow quiet. And someone in your group would begin to sing. I lift my eyes up to the heavens. Where does my help come from? My help comes from you, maker of heaven, creator of the earth. Oh, how I need you, Lord. You're my only hope. You're my only prayer. I lift my eyes up. And so as one person would start to sing one of those psalms, that was part of Psalm 121, somebody else would join in, and everyone would be singing and reciting and going through all of these psalms from 120 to 134, preparing their hearts to enter into God's city, and they would be walking and praying and thinking and reflecting upon the salvation that was brought upon the Israelites when they entered into the promised land, when they were delivered from bondage of Egypt, and they're reflecting on all of that. They're reflecting on the Passover lamb that passed over the death that passed over them and the blood of the lamb, and they have the lambs with them for sacrifice if they're not buying them at the temple, and they're walking forward just praising God and preparing their hearts, singing these psalms. They get to this one. Imagine walking with Jesus and you don't even know. It's like going right over your head, and you're singing this, a song of the ascents. This is the beginning of the psalm. It says a song of the ascents. And so they would begin singing this. Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord. O Lord, hear my voice. Let your ears be attentive to my cry for mercy. Oh Lord, hear my voice. And they're walking, and right beside them is the physical incarnation of God the Creator, the Logos of the world, walking with them. And they continue singing. If you, O Lord, kept a record of sins, O Lord, who could stand? But with you there is forgiveness. Therefore you are feared. I wait for the Lord. My soul waits, and in his word I put my hope. My soul waits for the Lord more than a watchman waits for the morning. More than a watchman waits for the morning. O Israel, I put your hope in the Lord, for the Lord is unfailing love, and with him is full redemption. He himself will redeem Israel from all their sins. The full redemption, he himself will redeem, and they're singing this, and Jesus is right beside him, right beside them. And they're preparing their hearts to enter in. And they see Jerusalem from the distance and the anticipation of real, heartfelt worship of God and sacrificing over the idea of our sins and the need for forgiveness. And this is where they're going. And so here we are, back in our text. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and brothers and his disciples. There they stayed for a few days. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. All of that is happening, what we just talked about. In the temple courts, he found men selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. So he made a whip out of cords and drove all from the temple area, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. Why would he do that? In the temple courts, he found men selling cattle, sheep. You see, the temple is designed to be a place of worship for all nations, not just people who are Jewish. And there's an area called the court of the Gentiles. A Gentile is just another way of saying someone who is not Jewish. And there was a court that was designated for them to be able to worship God, to enter into the temple and worship God. And history tells us that Caiaphas, the high priest, had arguments and debated with the Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council. And Caiaphas' position was that it would be more convenient to offer sacrifices for the people at the temple as opposed to everyone bringing their sacrifices with them. And so at Caiaphas' order, he wins out. They set up this court of Gentiles, gets crowded out and becomes non-existent. And so they're selling all of the things for convenience because people need to offer a lamb at Passover. At Passover, 250,000 sacrifices were made. 250,000. And so Caiaphas gets his tentacles in there, and he's making some money off of all of this. And they have money changers in the temple area because they won't allow, it has to be pure. The temple has to be pure, so they won't allow coinage that has the image of another god on it. And so they exchange currency for something that is acceptable. And so the money changers are there, but they take a percentage of it. They get a cut out of all of that. And so Jesus enters in and he sees this. And he sees no access being allowed for those who are not Jewish, and that they're being entirely pushed out. And there are animals in their place and people making profit. And he makes a cord, a whip out of cords, and he drives them out of the temple area. He flips over tables, he flips over money, and coins are scattered, and he essentially stops sacrifices because that's how they were being done. He essentially shuts down temporarily this whole thing, and this is a major, major thing. To those who sold doves, he said, "Get these out of here. How dare you turn my Father's house into a market?" His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." Now, what's interesting about this is that John puts this event at the beginning of his gospel. Matthew, Luke, and Mark have an event that they put at the end of their gospel. That Jesus does this at the end, and this becomes the catalyst event that forces them to really want to plot against him and kill him, because he goes in and he shuts the temple down. And so John puts it right smack at the beginning. We're only in chapter 2. And so scholars debate, who's right? Did it happen at the end or did it happen at the beginning? And we really don't have a good answer for that. But it seems to me that it's very likely that it happened twice. That we don't have to pick whether it happened at the beginning or the end. But John, for some reason, and we'll find out in a moment, puts it at the beginning. And so he says, his disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." It didn't happen. They didn't connect the dots until after the resurrection. They didn't put the pieces together. This is about to go right over their heads as well. And so here's the verse in Isaiah. "These I will bring to my holy mountain and give them joy in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and sacrifices will be accepted on my altar, for my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations." And so in the temple area, what you see around these walls, there's another wall around it, but around those walls is the court of the Gentiles, where they could come to worship God. And they are not being allowed to. And Jesus is going crazy, and he sends them all out. And now we move to part 2 of that text, the reaction to what's going on. "Then the Jews demanded of him, 'What miraculous sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all this?'" It's interesting that they don't say, "Why are you doing this?" They want to know by what authority you're doing this, but they're not asking, "Why are you doing this?" I think that everyone knew it was wrong, but they wouldn't go against the establishment. I think everyone knew it was wrong, but they wouldn't go against the flow. And so they allowed it. And I imagine that when Jesus pulls these cords together into a whip and starts flipping things over, casting people out, flipping money tables over, I imagine that as he's doing this, everyone is silent. Some of the people there are saying, "Yes, it's about time someone came in and brought some fresh air into this place. Yes, this is right." I'm sure that the Gentiles that were there were probably weeping, saying, "Finally, someone to allow us to worship God." And I imagine that some of the people there who were making profit were pretty ticked off. Jesus goes into Jerusalem. It would be like one of us going into Washington, D.C. and flipping everything over and changing everything around. And wouldn't that be interesting? I went to Jackson, Mississippi a number of years ago with students, and I met with a man. His name is John Perkins, and tomorrow we celebrate Martin Luther King Day. John Perkins was a colleague of Martin Luther King. John Perkins' brother got shot in the civil rights movement. They brought him into a hospital, and he was sent to the hospital on the other side of the city because they wouldn't treat blacks there. And his brother died in his arms. And I stood in Jackson, Mississippi with him outside of a church. And he told us the story of how they went to church. They went to that church to attend a church service, a worship service. And the elders of the church and the pastor stood locking arms across the access to the front of the church, saying, "You can't worship here." What would Jesus do if he entered into that temple? What kind of tables would he overturn? So the Jews, they demand, "What miraculous sign can you show us to prove your authority to do this?" And Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." The Jews replied, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you're going to raise it up in 3 days?" They're shocked. This temple isn't even finished yet. It's not going to be finished until 6 years before it's destroyed. In 70 AD, it's not even finished yet. Herod was crazy. He had trained 1,000 priests how to cut stone, because the only people who could cut the stones that were to the temple were priests, because he didn't want it to be defiled in any way. He wanted it to be pure. And so he has 1,000 priests. He has 18,000 full-time workers building this temple. There are stones in this temple that weigh 70 tons, 4.5 school buses stacked on top of each other. That's how much weight some of these stones. And Jesus comes in, and they're saying, by what authority? And he said, destroy this temple, and I'll rebuild it in 3 days. And they are like, what? If it wasn't such an incredible possession to them, they might have laughed. And so they say, 46 years, this has been being built for 46 years. You think you're going to tear it down and in 3 days build it back up again? But verse 21 is just classic. But the temple he had spoken of was his body. Greek word suma, clearly physical body. Jesus was saying to them, destroy this temple, and I'll rebuild it in 3 days. And they think he's talking about that. And he's talking about himself. I was blown away by the worship song that we just sang, one of the worship songs we just sang, that while he was laying on that stone grave, after 3 days, breath resumed. Imagine the quiet and the dark after 3 days, and hearing. Some probable form of light has shined, and angels around, and all of heaven and earth rejoice, because this one event changes everything. And what Jesus is saying is that temple is no more. And we're going to see this pattern over and over again that John tells us about this subversion. We talked about it last week, how James T. Kirk had a flip phone. And it was myth when he had his flip phone, before flip phones, but with telecommunications and the advancements of technology, it became real. And so John is in the context all the time of subverting. And so the Greek culture believes that the Logos is the infinite wisdom that's behind every word. And the Greeks have this whole philosophy that's been developed for 500 years about this idea of Logos. And John comes in the prologue and he says, take that out and put this in. He subverts the idea of the Greek culture of Logos. The Jewish culture of Logos, as we've said, the Jewish culture of Logos was how God spoke things into existence. And John comes in and he subverts that, and he says, it's more. Because that Logos became flesh and lived for a while among us. We've seen his glory, the glory of the one and only who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. And so John is saying that Logos is Jesus. And so in the beginning, we subvert both Jewish and Greek culture. And then John moves right away to the next thing, into the wine that we talked about last week. And we see that the purification of water being necessary to apply purification to someone. Jesus comes in and takes it out and puts in wine and says it's a sign that points to the blood. And that becomes purification for us. And he subverts the idea of water cleansing. And the Greek culture that had the god Dionysus, the god of wine, who could turn 3 stone jars into wine if left overnight, Jesus comes in and takes 6 stone jars and turns it into wine that were filled with water, and he does it in an instant. And he subverts the Greek culture of a god of wine. And this is now moving to the temple today. And please understand, he's subverting the temple, the very thing that everything revolved around. And he comes in and says, this temple will replace that temple in 3 days. That breath of life will prove that death has no more reign over us ever again. And after he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled that he had said that they believed the scripture and the words that Jesus had spoken. Now, while he was in Jerusalem at the Passover feast, many people saw the miraculous signs he was doing and believed in his name. But Jesus would not entrust himself to them, for he knew all men. He did not need man's testimony about man, for he knew what was in a man. So what would Jesus say today? You know, we think about the temple and how corrupt they were, but in the book of Revelation, John writes this to the 7 churches that are there. And we find that even a short time into the new church, Jesus would come into that place and turn tables and flip things over and cast things out. And so we see the 7 churches. We see the church of Ephesus has love, but it's shallow. And he says, return to your first love, or I will come and take your lampstand away. And so there's this idea of Jesus coming into the church and taking it away, or working in it. So the church of Ephesus is there, the church of Smyrna is there, and the church of Smyrna is persecuted, and there's nothing said about them in a negative way, but here is a church that's persecuted and keeping their faith in persecution. And we see the church in Pergamum, and here's what we see there, that the idolatry, that they expose themselves to idolatry, and they have bad theology. And they allow things to creep into the church that have no business being there. And Jesus again warns about a lampstand being taken away. And Thyatira, he tells them it's good that they have faith and love and good works. But you're tolerating adultery. You're tolerating things that should never be. And Jesus is about to come into this church and cleanse it. And what would he do here in our churches today? The church of Sardis is spiritually dead. The church of Philadelphia is spiritually alive. There's no rebuke for them. And the church of Laodicea is lukewarm. They're neither hot or cold. And Jesus says, I would spit you out of my mouth. Lukewarm. I like my coffee hot or cold. I'm not thrilled about lukewarm. And Jesus is saying these things to the churches. And so if this message is to the temple, it has to be to our churches as well. We have churches that are not compassionate. We have churches that are not reaching out. We have churches that are not holding true to the doctrine. We have churches that are spiritually dead. And we have churches like this that I believe are alive and breathing the breath of God. And we want to always monitor and keep track of that. But if we're going to do that, how do we do that? Well, we have to ask this question. Because if our church is going to stay on track, then we have to ask this dangerous question: what if? What if this is true, and it is true? Paul tells us in Corinthians, do you not know that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you received from God? You're not your own. You were bought with a price. And so if our body is the temple of God, how would Jesus react when entering your temple? How is he reacting? Would it be that he enters into a house of prayer? Would there be things on the table that he would want to flip over? Would there be things in your life, if Jesus were to enter your temple, would there be things on a table that he would want to flip over? Would there be people that he would seek to drive out? Would there be people who are influencing you and moving you in the wrong direction that he would want to say, take your stuff, move out? Don't think this isn't a challenging question to me. If he were to enter into my temple, he surely would find things to flip over, things to cast out, and things to say that needs to be put right. But I don't think that he's doing it with the expression of anger, because he knows all things. None of these things go over his head. He knows what you need. He knows what will make your life right. He knows what has to be. The question is, are we yielding to that, or are we, like the rest of the crowd, just thinking, this is wrong. I know it's wrong, but I don't think I can do anything about it. Perhaps we can't. Truth is, we can't. But he can. Are we willing to invite? Are we willing to go through the ascent process of calling on him for forgiveness, for restoration, for life? Let's pray. Father, I thank you for your grace. Lord, that you have provided us with everything that we need. Come into our temples and flip the things over that need to be flipped, and cast the things out that need to be put out, and bring us to a better place. We just ask this with humility. In Jesus' name, amen.